My affair partner fled and left me holding his child. I ordered my ex to be the father, held his innocent kids hostage as leverage when he dared to say no, and watched my new husband pack his bags and leave because he finally saw the real me. My affair partner fled and left me holding his child. I ordered my ex to be the father, held his innocent kids hostage as leverage when he dared to say no, and watched my new husband pack his bags and leave because he finally saw the real me. The baby was 3 weeks old when Lincoln stopped answering my calls. Not gradually. Not with the slow fade of someone who needs distance and takes it incrementally. One day he was there, and the next day the phone rang out, and the day after that it was disconnected, and I stood in my kitchen with a newborn against my chest and a disconnected number and the specific, clarifying silence of someone who has been left so completely that there is no door to knock on. He was gone. The man I had blown up my marriage for, the man I had told myself was different and worth it and the real thing, had looked at the reality of a child and a woman and a life and had made a calculation and disappeared from it entirely. I want to tell you that this was the moment I examined myself. That the weight of the baby in my arms and the disconnected phone and the wreckage of everything I had built and then destroyed produced in me the honest reckoning that the situation required. It did not. What it produced was a pivot. A fast, desperate, entitled pivot toward the nearest available solution. And the nearest available solution had a name, and that name was Joel, and Joel was my ex-husband, and Joel had done nothing to deserve what I was about to do to him. I picked up my phone and I called him. And when he answered, I did not lead with remorse or honesty or the acknowledgement of what I had cost him when I had ended our marriage to be with Lincoln. I led with need. I told him I needed him to step up and be a father to this baby. His baby. That is how I said it. His baby. I want you to hold that sentence while I tell you the rest. Joel and I had been married for 6 years before I ended it. 6 years that had produced 2 children, Aria and Sam, who were 4 and 6 at the time of the divorce and who are now 6 and 8 and who have lived inside the consequences of my choices with the innocent, absorbing confusion of children who did not choose any of it. He had been a good husband. I know this now in the way I know things that cost me everything to learn. He had been present and reliable and genuinely invested in the life we had built, and I had spent the last 2 years of our marriage finding reasons why present and reliable and invested were not enough. Finding them in the comparison to Lincoln, who was new and exciting and who made me feel chosen in the urgent, electric way that new things make you feel chosen before they reveal themselves to be only new. I told myself Joel and I had grown apart. I told myself I deserved more passion. I told myself the children would be fine and that 2 happy homes were better than 1 unhappy one, and I used this language so consistently that I eventually believed it the way you believe things you have repeated enough times without anyone pushing back hard enough. Nobody pushed back hard enough. Joel was too shocked to push back in the immediate aftermath, and then he was too focused on being present for Aria and Sam to spend energy fighting a decision I had already made, and then the divorce was final and I was with Lincoln and the story I had told myself had calcified into something I was not going to examine. I did not examine it. I should have examined it before I called Joel with a 3-week-old baby and a disconnected number. I need to tell you who Lincoln actually was, because I spent 2 years constructing a version of him that justified what I did to get to him, and the truth is simpler and uglier than the construction. Lincoln was 41 and charming in the specific way of men who have learned to be charming as a primary mode of engagement. He was good at the beginning of things. The intensity at the start, the making you feel seen and wanted and worth the disruption, the particular energy of someone investing in you as though you are a discovery they cannot believe they made. He was not good at what comes after the beginning. I had seen signs of this during the affair. The way he handled things that required consistency or sacrifice. The way he recalibrated when situations became complicated, moving the terms of what he was offering without acknowledging he was moving them. The way he talked about his previous relationships with a fluency that should have told me he had extensive practice explaining why things were never his fault. I saw these signs and I translated them into evidence of complexity rather than evidence of character, because I had already made the decision and the decision needed the evidence to say something other than what it was saying. When the pregnancy arrived, he did not leave immediately. He stayed through it, in a way that I now understand was the performance of staying rather than the actual thing, and then when the baby was real and present and the situation had mass and gravity and was going to require sustained presence rather than intermittent intensity, he made his calculation and he disappeared. He left me with an infant and a disconnected number and the full, unmediated reality of what I had traded my marriage for. And instead of sitting with that reality, I called my ex-husband. Joel answered on the 3rd ring. He had been raising Aria and Sam in the house we had shared, following the custody arrangement we had worked out, living the life of a man who had absorbed something large and kept going because his children needed him to keep going. He had not remarried. He had, from what I could observe through the ordinary channels of co-parenting, been doing the work of rebuilding a life while also showing up every day for 2 children who needed their father to show up. He answered and I told him what had happened. That Lincoln was gone. That the baby was 3 weeks old. That I needed help and that I needed it from him. The silence on the other end of the call was the silence of a man trying to understand the shape of what he was hearing. He said, carefully, "What exactly are you asking me?" I told him I needed him to be in the baby's life. To step into the role. To be the father that Lincoln was not going to be. Another silence. He said, "This isn't my child." And I said, with the confidence of someone who had already decided how the conversation was going to go and was not interested in the detours, "I know that. But the kids need to see their sibling have a father. And you're the one they already have." I used the children as the argument. I want you to mark that. I had a 3-week-old and a disconnected number, and I used his children as the argument for why he should take on the child I had produced with the man I had left him for. He said he needed time to think. I said okay, and I hung up, and I expected that thinking would produce agreement because I was not yet capable of imagining that what I was asking was something a reasonable person could decline. He called back 2 days later and he said no. He said it gently, he said it clearly, and he said he was sorry for what I was going through and he would always be the father to Aria and Sam that they deserved, but that he was not able to be the father to a baby that was not his and that had come from circumstances that had caused significant harm to him and to his children. He said this calmly and without cruelty and with what I now recognize as an enormous amount of restraint. I did not receive it as restraint. I received it as obstruction. What happened next is the part of this I am most ashamed of and the part I avoided saying out loud for the longest time because saying it out loud required me to be honest about who I was in that moment. I told him that if he was not going to help me, I was going to need to make some adjustments to the custody arrangement. That I was dealing with a newborn and could not maintain the current schedule. That I was going to need to reduce his time with Aria and Sam while I got on my feet. I used his children as leverage. The children he had been raising, showing up for, organizing his life around. The children I had given him and the marriage I had ended. I used them as a lever to try to move him into doing what I wanted, and I told myself, in the story I was running simultaneously, that I was just being honest about my capacity and not that I was weaponizing access to his children to punish him for a reasonable refusal. The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. It had a quality I did not have language for at the time and that I understand now as the sound of a good person encountering the information that they have been more patient than the situation deserved. He said, very quietly, "Don't do that." I said I was not doing anything, I was just being realistic about what I could manage. He said he would be speaking to his lawyer. He hung up. I want to stop here and account for the internal monologue that was running during this period, because the internal monologue is as much a part of the story as the actions. I was telling myself a version of events in which I was a woman in crisis who needed help and was being denied it by someone who had the capacity to give it and was choosing not to out of lingering resentment. I was telling myself that the leverage was not leverage but logistics. That using the custody schedule as a negotiating point was not manipulation but necessity. That asking Joel to step into a parental role for a child that was not his was not entitlement but practicality, and that any reasonable person could see the practical logic of it if they set aside their feelings. I was very good at this. The reframing. I had been doing it for years, reframing the things I wanted to do into the things I needed to do, and the machinery of it was practiced and fast and largely invisible to me. The baby cried and I picked her up and I told myself that I was doing what I had to do, and the story held together well enough for me to continue operating inside it. Her name is Eva. I should tell you her name. She is not responsible for any of this and she was lying in my arms while I was making phone calls that were going to make her life more complicated, and she had no idea, and she looked up at me with the unfocused, trusting gaze of a newborn and I chose, in her presence, to continue making those calls. Simon was my new husband. I should have introduced him sooner, but I have been building to this because he is the person in this story I damaged most unexpectedly. The person who had arrived after Lincoln, who had seen what he believed was a woman who had made mistakes and grown from them and was building something better, and who was going to spend 8 months watching that belief be dismantled by evidence he could not ignore. We had met 14 months after the divorce, when Eva was about 4 months old. He was good in ways that were quieter than Lincoln's good and more real. He was steady without making steadiness a performance. He had known from the beginning about Eva and Lincoln and the full shape of the situation, or so I had believed. In retrospect, I had given him the managed version. Enough truth to satisfy the question but not enough to constitute the full picture. He fell in love with the managed version. He helped with Eva. He was present with Aria and Sam when they were at our place. He built a version of blended family life with genuine investment and care, and I watched him do it and accepted it and told myself that this was what choosing better looked like, without being honest with him or myself about the fact that I had not yet done the actual work of understanding why I had chosen badly before. We got married when Eva was 14 months old. He deserved more information than he had. What he had was a story I had curated, and the curation was a form of dishonesty that I had not named as dishonesty because it did not contain explicit lies, just arranged truths. The arrangement was going to come apart. The custody situation did not resolve the way I had threatened. Joel's lawyer contacted my lawyer and the message was clear: any attempt to use the custody schedule as leverage in matters unrelated to Aria and Sam's welfare would be addressed in court, and the court would be provided with context for the attempt. I backed down. I backed down because I had no ground to stand on and because the threat of a judge hearing the context was clarifying in a way that my own ethics had not been. I backed down and I resented it, which tells you something about where I was. Joel continued being an excellent father to Aria and Sam. He showed up for every scheduled time and some unscheduled ones when I needed flexibility, and he was the kind of co-parent who absorbed the ordinary inconveniences of shared parenting without making them into negotiations. He did not bring up the phone call or the threat. He simply continued to be who he was, which was a better person than the situation required him to be, and which was a fact I was not yet ready to sit with. Eva's biological father, Lincoln, surfaced once. About 4 months after disappearing, he sent a text. It said he was sorry and that he had panicked and that he wanted to know how the baby was. I told him her name. He said she was beautiful. He did not ask to be involved. He did not offer money or presents or any concrete form of responsibility. He said she was beautiful and then he was quiet again, and then eventually the quiet became permanent. I have handled Eva's birth certificate and the legal reality of her father's absence through the appropriate channels. She will grow up knowing what can be known and not knowing what cannot, and I am trying, now, to make sure that what she grows up in is something honest rather than something managed. She deserves honest. The marriage to Simon lasted 13 months. I want to account for what ended it because the ending was not a single event but an accumulation of evidence that Simon was patient enough to keep asking questions about until the questions had answers he could not accommodate. He had been watching the Joel situation from the beginning. Not with suspicion, not initially, but with the attentive concern of someone who cares about the person they are with and wants to understand what they are dealing with. He had heard my version of the phone call and the custody threat, which was the version in which I had been desperate and had not handled it well but had been under extraordinary pressure and had ultimately done the right thing. He had accepted that version. But he had also seen, over months of shared life, the pattern that the version existed within. The way I handled things that did not go as I wanted. The way negotiations operated in our own relationship. The way I responded to refusal or disappointment with a pressure that was not always visible as pressure but that accumulated and had direction. He had started to see the architecture. He came to me about 6 months into the marriage and said he wanted to talk about some things. He was not accusatory. He was the kind of person who approaches difficult conversations with the care of someone who actually wants to understand rather than to win. He asked me questions about the Joel phone call that went deeper than I had allowed the previous conversation to go. He asked what I had actually said. What I had meant by it. Whether I had understood at the time what I was doing. I gave him a version that was closer to the truth than what I had given him before, but still not the full truth. Still the version with the edges softened and the worst moments slightly reframed. He listened and he was quiet and he said, "I feel like I'm still not getting the whole picture." I told him he was. He looked at me with the expression of someone who knows they are not getting the whole picture and is deciding what to do with that knowledge. He decided, that night, to give it more time. He gave it 7 more months. What broke it was a conversation he had with Simon's sister, who knew Joel through a professional overlap I had not been aware of. Not a planned conversation. An incidental one, at an event, where Joel's name came up and the sister made a connection and said something to Simon about the situation that contained information I had not given him. Not secrets. Facts. The actual facts of the phone call and the custody threat, heard from someone who had heard them from Joel without the curation I had applied. The shape of what I had actually said. The children actually named as leverage. The demand that a man be the father of a child he had not fathered and that had come from the affair that ended their marriage. Simon came home from that event and he sat across from me and he said, very carefully, "I need you to tell me what actually happened when you called Joel after Eva was born." And I knew, from the quality of the question, that the version I had been offering was no longer the one being requested. I told him. Not the softened version. The real one. I am not entirely sure why I chose that moment to tell the real version. Maybe I was tired of the weight of it. Maybe I could see in his face that he already had enough of the truth that the softened version was no longer going to hold. Maybe something in me understood that the marriage was already in the place where only honesty had any remaining value and even honesty might not be enough. I told him about the phone call. I told him about using the children as leverage. I told him the actual words I had said to Joel and what I had been trying to accomplish with them. I told him that the version I had given him before had been the version I was able to give at the time, and that I was giving him the real version now. He sat with it. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Who else have you given the managed version to?" It was the question that told me he understood more than the specific incident. He was asking about a pattern. He had seen it in our own relationship, in the small ways I had shaped information, and he was now understanding those small ways as part of something larger. I said I didn't know how to answer that. He said, "I think you do." He was right. I did. Part 2 continues below. Part 2. Simon did not leave that night. He stayed for 3 more weeks, and those 3 weeks were the most honest weeks of our marriage because the version I had been offering had collapsed and there was nothing left to offer except the real thing, and I offered it with the desperation of someone who understands too late that honesty was always what was required. He asked questions and I answered them. Real answers, the kind that required me to go back into things I had been avoiding and bring them into the light where they could be looked at directly. He asked about Lincoln and I told him the real version of that story, the version in which I had seen the signs of who Lincoln was and translated them into evidence of complexity because I needed them to be something other than what they were. He asked about Joel and I told him the full arc of it, the marriage I had ended and why and the ways the why had never been as clean as I had made it sound. He asked about the custody threat and I told him what I had been thinking when I made it, the full internal logic of it, the way I had been able to call it necessity while I was doing it. He listened to all of it. He asked clarifying questions. He did not interrupt. He was trying to understand who I was, the real version, the version underneath the curation, and I was trying to show him because it was the only thing I had left to show. At the end of the 3rd week he told me he was going to stay with his brother for a while. He said he was not telling me it was over. He was telling me he needed space to think without the daily closeness of the marriage shaping his thinking. He said he had spent 13 months in love with a version of me that had been real enough to be convincing and that he needed time to understand what was real and what remained. He packed a bag. Not all his things. A bag. He hugged Eva. He told Aria and Sam, who were there that weekend, that he needed to take care of some things and would see them soon. Aria asked if he was coming back. He looked at her and then at me and he said he didn't know yet. He left. The door closed. I stood in the hallway with my 3 children looking at me, 2 of them old enough to understand that something was wrong and young enough to need me to tell them it wasn't, and the baby in my arms who understood nothing except that she was held. I told Aria and Sam that Simon needed some time and that we were going to be okay. I believed the second part less than I said it. I called my mother that night after the kids were in bed. My mother is a practical woman who has never been easy on me in the specific ways that I needed someone to not be easy on me, and I called her because I needed the version of support that was also honest. She asked what happened and I told her. The real version, the one I had been giving Simon across the previous 3 weeks, because I no longer had the energy to maintain separate versions for different audiences and because my mother would have found the holes anyway. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "You called Joel and told him to be the father of a baby you had with the man you left him for." I said yes. She said, "And when he said no, you threatened his access to his own children." I said yes. She said, "And you've been married to Simon for over a year without telling him what you actually did." I said yes. She was quiet again. Longer this time. She said, "I love you. And I need you to hear me when I say that you have been doing a version of this your whole life. Taking what you need from people and reframing it as something they should want to give you. And I should have said this to you a long time ago and I didn't, and that is something I have to live with. But you need to hear it now." I had been waiting for her to say it was going to be okay. She did not say it was going to be okay. She said, "What are you going to do differently?" I did not have an answer that night. I have been working on one since. Simon came back 3 weeks later to get more of his things. Not all of them. More of them. The distinction was something I held on to in the days that followed as evidence that the door was not fully closed, which it was not, but which was also not open in the way I needed it to be open. He came on a Saturday when the kids were at Joel's. We sat at the kitchen table where we had sat for 13 months of marriage, where I had made coffee on ordinary mornings and where we had talked about ordinary things, and he told me where he was. He said he had been thinking about what I had told him and thinking about the 13 months and trying to locate the person he had fallen in love with inside the full picture he now had. He said he could find her. That was not the problem. The problem was that he could also see the architecture around her, the machinery of self-protection and reframing and managed versions, and that he did not know how to be married to someone whose primary relationship was with the story she was telling rather than with what was actually happening. He said he had spent the 3 weeks asking himself if he believed I could do something different. If he had seen evidence in the 13 months that the architecture was something I was capable of examining rather than just operating from. He said the evidence was not conclusive. I asked him what conclusive would look like. He said he didn't know. That was the honest answer. He didn't know what conclusive looked like because he had not seen enough of the honest version of me to know what she was capable of. He said he was not filing for divorce yet. He said he was not making any decisions yet. He said he needed more time and that I needed to do something real in that time, not for him, but for myself, because if I did it for him it would be another version of doing what was needed to get what I wanted, and that was not what either of us needed. He picked up the bag he had packed and he left again. I stood at the window and watched his car until I could not see it. I started therapy the following week. Not because Simon asked me to. He had not asked me to. I started because my mother's question had been sitting in me since she asked it and I did not have an answer, and the absence of an answer was something I could no longer navigate around. What are you going to do differently? The therapist I found is a woman about 10 years older than me who has a stillness about her that I initially found frustrating because I am accustomed to filling silences and she does not fill them for me. She waits. The silences go where they go and she waits, and eventually I go somewhere honest because there is nothing else to do with the silence. The first thing she asked me to do is tell her about the phone call to Joel. I told her. She asked me to slow down at certain moments. To stay in specific parts of it longer. To tell her what I had been thinking in the moment, the actual thoughts, not the retrospective interpretation of them. It took 3 sessions to get through the phone call accurately. Because accuracy required going into things I had been moving quickly past for 2 years, the specific quality of my thinking in the moment I made the threat, what it had felt like to make it, what I had been telling myself it was while I was doing it. What I found, in those 3 sessions, was not a monster. I want to be clear about that because I think sometimes people expect the honest accounting to produce a revelation of pure selfishness and cruelty, some clarifying exposure of a person who knew they were doing harm and did not care. That is not what I found. What I found was something more ordinary and in some ways more unsettling, a person who had become so practiced at the reframe happened automatically, before the honest assessment had a chance to form. The machinery operated faster than the conscience. By the time I was making the threat I had already, in my internal accounting, converted it into something else, and I had been living in the converted version so long I had forgotten there had been a conversion. I had not known I was doing harm in the way that you know something you have allowed yourself to know. I had known it in the way you know things you have arranged not to look at. The therapy is teaching me to look. Joel and I had a conversation about 4 months after the Simon situation began. The first real conversation, not a custody logistics call but an actual conversation, that we had had in years. He asked how I was doing. Not as a formality. As a genuine question from someone who had known me for a long time and who, despite everything, had not converted his knowledge of me into permanent contempt. I told him the truth. That things were hard. That Simon had left, temporarily or not, and that I was in therapy and that I had been sitting with what I had done and that the sitting was not comfortable. He was quiet. He said, "I know." I said I was sorry. Not the logistics sorry I had offered before, not the sorry that was primarily a tool for moving the conversation forward. The kind that has been arrived at through actual understanding of the harm. I said I was sorry for the phone call and for the threat and for the years before that in which I had been in a marriage with him while already having left it internally, and for the way I had framed the ending in terms that made him the insufficient one rather than me the person who had made choices I was not honest about. He did not say it was okay. He said he appreciated me saying it. There is a difference between those two things and he knew the difference and chose the accurate one. He asked about Eva. I told him she was good. That she was starting to walk, listing to one side with the determined wobble of a child who is committed to vertical movement regardless of the obstacles. He laughed. A small laugh, real. He said Aria and Sam were doing well. That Sam had started soccer and was surprisingly good at it, and that Aria had developed an obsession with a particular book series that she was reading with an intensity that reminded him of me at that age. That last part landed somewhere I was not prepared for it to land. He remembered what I was like at that age. He had known me long enough to have that memory. And he was not weaponizing it or using it to demonstrate what I had cost both of us. He was just telling me that our daughter reminded him of me and letting that be a simple, ordinary thing between two people who had once loved each other and made children together. I cried after we hung up. Not performance. The real kind, the kind that comes when something true arrives and you were not braced for it. Simon and I are separated. I want to say that clearly because it would be dishonest to imply otherwise. The 3 weeks became 2 months became something that does not have a clean name yet. We are in contact. He knows I am in therapy. He has asked, through the ordinary channels of two people trying to figure out what they are to each other, about Eva, and his questions about her have the warmth of someone who genuinely cares about a child he helped raise for over a year. I do not know what that means for us. I'm trying to resist the part of me that immediately calculates what it means for us, that converts his warmth toward Eva into evidence for a conclusion I want to reach. The therapy is teaching me to notice when I am doing that and to not follow the machinery where it wants to go. He asked me last month what I was learning. In a text, out of nowhere on a Tuesday afternoon. Just, what are you learning? I thought about it for a long time before I answered. I told him I was learning the difference between the story I was telling and what was actually happening. That I had been so practiced at the story that I had stopped checking whether it matched reality, and that the checking was slow and uncomfortable and produced information I would have preferred not to have. I told him I was learning that the people I had treated as problems to be solved or resources to be accessed were people with actual interiors that I had not been curious about in the way they deserved. I told him I was learning that the version of love I had been operating from was one that was primarily about what it could give me, and that I had been confusing the taking with the feeling. He did not respond immediately. 2 days later he said, I hear you. That is where we are. I hear you. Not I forgive you or I'm coming home or everything is going to be fine. I hear you. From a man who spent 13 months being given a curated version and who was now receiving, in small pieces, the real one. I do not know what he will decide. I'm trying to want his honest decision more than I want a specific outcome, and that wanting is something I have to actively choose rather than something that comes naturally, and some days I choose it better than others. Eva is 2 now. She walks without listing anymore and she has opinions about everything and she says her own name in a way that drops the first letter so it comes out as Ava, which has become what we call her in the house. She does not know her father. She will, eventually, know what can be known about him, which is that he existed and that he left and that his leaving was a fact about him and not a fact about her. I'm trying to make sure that what she knows about herself is built on something honest. Not the managed version of her origins. The real one, age-appropriately offered over time, with the honesty she deserves about how she came to be here and who the people around her are. Aria and Sam know that Simon is not living with us right now. They have been told, in the way you tell children things that are true without making the full complexity of the truth their burden, that adults sometimes need time to figure things out. Sam accepted this with the pragmatic flexibility of an 8-year-old who has been through enough transition to have developed adaptation as a skill. Aria, who is 6 and pays closer attention than her age suggests, asked if it was because of something she did. I told her no. Absolutely, clearly no. I told her that the things that happen between adults are adult things and that she had done nothing and was responsible for nothing and that she was loved without condition by every adult in her life. I told her this and I meant every word of it, and it is the kind of thing I should have been more consistent about demonstrating across the years that produced the situation she is navigating. She said okay and went back to her book. She reminded me of me at that age, apparently. I'm trying to make sure what she inherits from that resemblance is the better parts. Here is what I know now that I did not know when Lincoln's phone was disconnected and I pivoted toward Joel. I know that need is not the same as entitlement. That being in a desperate situation does not generate a claim on other people's resources or labor or emotional capacity. That the people I looked at as solutions were people with their own interiors and their own damages and their own things they were already carrying, and that what I was asking them to carry was not mine to assign. I know that the managed version is a form of lying even when it contains no explicit lies. That the curation of truth is dishonesty when it is done to produce a specific response rather than to genuinely communicate. That I had been doing this for so long that I had lost track of where the curation ended and I began. I know that children absorb things they are not supposed to absorb. That Aria and Sam have been inside my choices for 8 years and that the interior of that experience is something they are building their understanding of the world from, and that what I give them to build with matters in ways that extend past what I can see or manage. I know that the people who stayed, Joel and his patient co-parenting, my mother and her uncomfortable honesty, Simon and his I hear you, were not staying because I had earned their staying. They were staying because they were better than what the situation required and because they had made decisions about their own character that I had not yet fully made about mine. I am making them now. Not quickly. Not with a completeness that would allow me to call this a redemption. The word redemption is not available to me, I am not reaching for it. What I am reaching for is honesty sustained over time without an audience, without a specific person I am performing it for, without a goal that the honesty is instrumental toward. Just honesty. As a practice. As the baseline rather than the exception. Some days it holds. Some days the machinery kicks in before I catch it and I am 3 sentences into a managed version before I notice and stop and go back and say the real thing instead. The going back is the work. I did not used to go back. I am learning to go back. It is not enough. I know it is not enough for the people I have already moved through and cost things they cannot get back. Joel's years. Simon's 13 months. Aria and Sam's stability. Eva's first weeks with a mother who was on the phone trying to assign her to someone who had not agreed to her. It is not enough, and it is also the only thing available to me now. The real thing, practiced daily, offered without guarantee of outcome. I pick Eva up from the floor where she has been pulling herself up on the coffee table, and I hold her, and she looks at me with the unguarded directness of a 2-year-old who does not yet know that people have managed versions. She just sees me. I'm trying to make sure that what she sees, over time, is something I would not have to reframe to make acceptable. I'm trying to be someone who does not need the reframe. That is the whole of what I have left to offer. It is going to have to be enough to start with.